And live from Studio 14 here at Al Jazeera headquarters in Doha, I'm Kamal Santamaria. Welcome to the NewsGrid. A revolution takes its final breaths. 57 years after bringing socialism to Cuba, Fidel Castro is dead. The reaction is as varied as it is wide. We'll be live across the Americas with extensive coverage of a man and a movement which shaped much of 20th century global politics.
And we want to hear from you. Castro, hero or villain? Share your views with us on Twitter using the hashtag AJNewsGrid.
Also on the grid, the largest protest in South Korea's modern history. It started in Seoul, but it's spread right across the country now. More than 1 million people demanding President Park Geun-hye resign over a corruption scandal. But you know, even with her approval ratings plunging to a record low, Park is still refusing to step down. And a drug that's ruined tens of thousands of lives in Thailand, but one minister thinks the only way to stop the methamphetamine epidemic is to decriminalise it. We want to know what you think too. Should drugs abuse be treated as a health issue or a crime? You're with the NewsGrid live on air and streaming online through YouTube, Facebook Live and at aljazeera.com. And the death of a former president is usually pretty big news. But when the country concerned is Cuba, it is much, much more than that. As you will no doubt know by now, Fidel Castro is dead, and with him go the last vestiges of the old Cuba, if you like, 10 years after he handed power to his brother Raul as his health failed. Now, how you remember Castro, of course, depends on who you are, where you live, and how he affected you. For Cubans in exile in Miami, well, the reaction has been like this. Joy, celebrations on the street. They were out at 1 in the morning. Well, there's Andy Gallagher. We're going to talk to him shortly. Joy that the man who'd led their country's revolution, but also isolated it from the rest of the world, was now consigned to history. Whilst in Havana, the Cuban capital, far more somber mood there. Yes, the Castro name lives on through President Raul, but for so many Cubans who stayed, Fidel was always their leader. Well, we've got a lot of ground and reaction to cover, but I think it's best if we start here. The moment when Raul Castro announced the news on Cuban television.
Querido pueblo de Cuba.
Dear people of Cuba, with deep sadness I inform my people, the friends of our America and the world, on Friday at 10:29 in the night, the Commander-in-Chief of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro Ruz, has died. According to the will of Comrade Fidel, his remains will be cremated. On Saturday, the commission in charge of organizing the funeral will give our people detailed information about the organization of the honors that will be paid to the founder of the Cuban Revolution. Until the everlasting victory, always.
So as I said, we're live all over the Americas for this one. Our correspondent, US State Department correspondent Rosalind Jordan, she's in Washington, D.C. We have also got Andy Gallagher. He is live in Miami, where, as we saw, those exiles and migrants have been celebrating. And also, who have we got? Monica Villamazar, a little bit further south in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Reaction from right across the continent. Only person missing, though, is our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman. She's actually in the air right now, due to land in Cuba within hours. Until then, we have this report from her on the life and times of Fidel Castro.
Few men in the world have been as idolized and at the same time as hated as Cuba's Fidel Castro. A man who to some was a revolutionary legend in his own time, while to others a merciless communist dictator. In 2006, Castro disappeared from the public eye after emergency intestinal surgery forced him to hand over power to his younger brother, Raul. But he did not disappear entirely from the scene. Already in his 80s and visibly frail, he defied all predictions and began appearing in public, reinforcing his bigger-than-life image. For nearly 5 decades, he determined the fate of generations of Cubans, while becoming the ideological godfather of left-wing leaders all over Latin America. Fidel Castro came to power in 1959 after leading a popular revolution against Cuba's then-dictator Fulgencio Batista. From the beginning, the charismatic but temperamental Castro left no one indifferent. The bearded revolutionary's leftist ideology soon clashed with the United States, pushing the Caribbean nation into the arms of the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. In October 1962, Soviet missiles were brought to the communist island in what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of a nuclear war.
Y que esa revolución socialista la defendemos con esos fusiles.
Washington responded with an economic embargo that continues to this very day. Fearing they would lose everything, thousands of well-off and middle-class Cubans fled the country, while the millions who remained became part of a grand experiment to create what Castro and fellow revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara called the new man. It was the creation of a communist-inspired socialist society with only one political party, led by one man, Fidel Castro.
I'm going to tell you something. He will never be absent. His ideas will last forever.
Castro's revolution did provide education and health care to all, and did much to address racial inequality.
When you look dispassionately at the Cuban experience, and you see that there are no children begging on the streets, or people searching through the rubbish bin for food, and that there's education, I think for a small, poor country like Cuba, suffering from an embargo, that is an impressive achievement.
But at what price? During his long rule, thousands of opponents were imprisoned, sent into exile, or both. According to Castro, anyone who dissented was a traitor at the service of U.S. imperialism. Hubert Matus, who died in 2014, was a former revolutionary who spent 20 years in prison for opposing Castro.
What Castro did was take away all the rights of the Cubans. He turned the whole country into a huge prison.
Castro was never able to achieve a socialist land of milk and honey, not even when the former Soviet Union was subsidizing his economy. True, the U.S. economic embargo did take its toll, but Castro used it to justify all the nation's problems. Critics say that Castro's refusal to budge from his outdated and inefficient socialist model is to blame for the impoverishment of his people. Facing near total bankruptcy, in 2010, Cuba loosened some state controls over the economy, but not over the political system. At the Communist Party Congress in April 2011, Fidel Castro received a standing ovation as his younger brother took over the last of his titles as first secretary of the all-powerful party. The age of Fidel Castro was coming to an end. It would be the more pragmatic Raúl Castro who would oversee the historic restoration of diplomatic ties with Washington. Until the very end, Fidel Castro was a proud man who scoffed at international and domestic criticism, always insisting that his was the most democratic system in the world, convinced until his dying breath that his revolution would survive him. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera.
Okay, so let's go around the grounds now. We'll start with Rosalind Jordan in Washington, D.C. I've just been told in my ear we've had some reaction from President Obama.
That's right. The past several hours, the Obama administration has been working on this statement. I'm just going to read a couple of sentences from a rather lengthy statement from the President, Barack Obama. At this time of Fidel Castro's passing, we extend a hand of friendship to the Cuban people. We know that this moment fills Cubans, both in Cuba and the United States, with powerful emotions, recalling the countless ways in which Fidel Castro altered the course of individual lives, families, and of the Cuban nation. History will record and judge the enormous impact of this singular figure on the people and world around him. And that's about as descriptive as it gets, Kamal. We don't get into the years of rancor and tension between the United States and Cuba. First, there was a prototypical colonial relationship at the beginning of the 20th century between the U.S. and Cuba. Then there were the years where the U.S. Supported a number of leaders who were considered right-wing dictators. And then there was the coming of Fidel Castro taking power in 1959. Even though the U.S. at first extended a bit of financial aid, It was quickly rebuffed, and then the relationship basically was a prototypical, very tense one at the height of the Cold War. Of course, people will remember the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which historians and experts say was the closest that the world ever came to an all-out nuclear war. Only in the past year and a half has the U.S. and Cuba tried to work out a normalization of relationships, but it is still a very, very strained relationship. It is one that is politically a little more open, but the U.S. still has deep concerns about Cuba's human rights record.
Okay, that's the latest with Rosalind Jordan in Washington, D.C. Andy Gallagher next, I think it is. Let's go to Miami and talk to you, Andy, who's been up since the early hours of the morning. You've seen it all since the news was announced. Andy, it's Kamal here. Can you hear me? No, apparently not. Right, let's move down to Sao Paulo then. Monica Villamizar, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Kamal.
Brilliant, thank you. Bring us up to date. I guess what I want from you is a bit of wider explanation about the effect of Castro, how he was viewed across wider Latin America.
Absolutely, Kamal. Just to give some context to our viewers, basically everybody here in Latin America knows who Fidel Castro is. Everybody right now is talking about what happened. He was such a larger-than-life figure, for better or worse. Very, very divisive person, but everybody in Latin America saw him as the leader of this tiny island who sort of put it on the map and fought the empire. That's why normal people here in Latin America are talking about him, politicians are talking about him. Now, it's important to say that every political decision made in the last decades in Latin America was also taken based on Fidel Castro. We don't want to become Cuba, some governments would say. We don't want to be the communist system, so they would react and see, and very much oppose his views. Other Latin American leaders really saw him as a mentor. And right now in Latin America, everybody is thinking about what's going to happen. I mean, of course, maybe things on the ground won't change that much. He had been out of public view for a while, but it is definitely something enormously historic here.
I wonder if the other bit of context you could give us, Monica, is how Fidel differs from Raul. Raul's been in power for 10 years. The Castro name is still there. How different are the two men?
Well, that's a great question. He is seen as someone a lot more pragmatic. While Latin American leaders, as you know, Hugo Chavez first, and then Maduro, but also the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, and here in Brazil, even Lula da Silva, and his successor, Dilma Rousseff, they all saw Fidel as pretty much the father of the revolution, of all left-wing movements, and he was very much an active advisor to their governments. Raul is seen as someone a lot more pragmatic, a lot more open-minded, if you will, and proof of that is that he distanced himself from Venezuela and said, well, you know what, in economic hardships like we are living, maybe we should start negotiating with the United States. A huge step that many believe would not have taken place had his brother still been in power in the island.
All right, Monica Villamizar's in Sao Paulo. Hopefully going to get to Andy Gallagher in Miami a little bit later. A few technical problems with him. In the meantime, though, Daniel Pidera joining us from Miami on Skype, an aide to U.S. Congresswoman Elena Ros-Lehtinen, who is the chairwoman of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs, and he is an analyst on Cuban affairs. And Cuban yourself, I believe, Daniel. Would you mind giving me, if you don't mind, a little bit of personal reaction to what you felt when you heard the news today?
Well, first, I want to clear up, I'm a former staffer for the Congresswoman. And now I'm a PhD student at FIU, Florida International University. But my reaction was kind of the same reaction that a lot of people felt, and it was more than celebration. You know, it's more contemplative. It's more of a moral vindication for so many years of the suffering, knowing the stories of all the executed, all the political prisoners, all of the people who had to leave their homeland with, in many cases, literally the clothes on their backs, all the suffering of the people that were never able to go back. because they died in exile. So it's for me, it's more thinking about family members who were never able to go back, who suffered so much, and also people that over the years I've grown up with, I've come to know very well and know their stories, and so that's kind of been my reflective mood.
Daniel, does it change the future? As I just pointed out with our correspondent Monica, Raul Castro has been in power for 10 years. Does it change now that Fidel is actually gone? Does it accelerate any re-emergence for Cuba? What changes?
It does change the image of the political system, the political scene in Cuba. I don't necessarily believe that it'll be an overnight change, but I think that removing the symbolic image of Fidel Castro, much like has happened in other dictatorships, like with Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, with Franco in Spain, even with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, removing that key paternal central figure has been has led to change in many in the minds of the population in those countries, and that over time, I think it needs to sink in that he's gone, that he's not a presence anymore, which will take some time. It's hard to predict, but I think once that happens, it's kind of a step that needed to occur before the Cuban people can move on and close that chapter in Cuban history and really look to the future and really look forward to positive changes, positive democratic changes for their country.
What a fascinating time, isn't it? Daniel Pujera joining us from Miami. Thank you for that. Now, there's Andy Gallagher live in Miami. Hi, Andy. Can you hear me all right this time?
I can hear you fine this time.
Brilliant. Tell me what it's been like. You've been up since 1 in the morning, I think, so you've kind of seen it all there in Little Havana.
Yeah, I mean, really scenes of unadulterated jubilation here in Little Havana. The crowds have been gathering all throughout the early hours of the morning. Flags are being waved, tears streaming down people's faces, fists being shook. There is absolute celebration here. Many people telling me they didn't think they would live to see the day that Fidel Castro died. It seems crass perhaps to some, but you have to remember this is a community that considers itself an exile community. There are 1 million Cuban Americans here in Miami, and for them, Fidel Castro represents repression. He's someone who jailed their relatives, killed their relatives, took away their personal property, and forced hundreds and thousands of people to make that dangerous crossing from the island of Cuba across the Florida Straits here to the United States. So scenes of jubilation just basically about half an hour after the news broke at around midnight last night, all throughout the early hours. If I just step out of the shop here and we pan down, you can see the crowds that are gathering outside Café Versailles, which is really the cultural heart of Little Havana. And I expect these crowds will grow a great deal over the next few hours and days as well. I was here 10 years ago when Fidel Castro ceded power to Raul, and it was a party that lasted for about 3 or 4 days. This is very different. Remember, we've had lots of false alarms here over the last few years, at least 2 or 3 a year in the 10 years that I've been here. But finally, for this community, this is the end of an era and a man they have long wanted to see gone from the international scene.
Great insight from Andy Gallagher there in Little Havana in Miami. Thank you for that. Getting your comments coming into us here at the NewsGrid as well. Do send in anything through Twitter, Facebook or WhatsApp. In fact, there are the details right now. We've had a comment on WhatsApp from Uganda saying Fidel was a hero who will never be forgotten, but similarly someone calling him a tyrant. Lauren calls him a tyrant. Mary Elizabeth says perhaps the greatest leader of the 20th and 21st centuries. I'm sad and may he rest in peace. Definitely a strong leader. I guess whether he was great or not depends on your viewpoint. Lots of varying opinions coming in on Facebook Live. If you're watching, facebook.com/AJ NewsGrid. Thank you for watching and do keep sending in your comments. So that's what you've been thinking. Here is how some global leaders used social media to react to Castro's passing. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi said Fidel Castro was one of the most iconic personalities of the 20th century. India mourns the loss of a great friend. typically charged response next from Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro. To all the revolutionaries of the world, we have to continue with his legacy and his flag of independence, of socialism, of homeland. And Enrique Peña Nieto of Mexico said Fidel Castro was a friend of Mexico, promoter of a bilateral relationship based on respect, dialogue, and solidarity. As for the next US president, it's kind of hard to know what he thinks. All Donald Trump said on Twitter, presumably when he woke up in the morning, was, "Fidel Castro is dead!" Exclamation mark. Points for accuracy, 34,000 retweets, 53,000 likes for those 4 words. Andrew Chappelle, looking at other social media, what have you been getting in from our community and from what you've seen online?
Well, let's just take a look at this heat map. So this is the reaction to the news of Fidel Castro's death. So that came out right around 7G, I believe this is, and it just took over the world in terms of social media. I just checked a few minutes ago, and there's been more than 2 million tweets just about Fidel Castro. Lots of people sharing their perspective about his legacy, and definitely some strong opinions on both sides of the aisle there. The congresswoman who we referenced earlier with our guest, she tweeted earlier today that after so many decades of oppression, the tyrant Castro is dead, and a new beginning can finally dawn on Cuba and its people. Another congressional representative in Florida, who's also of Cuban descent, tweeted, "The passing of the dictator marks the end of a long, horrifying chapter in Cuba's history. The Cuban people need our solidarity." Now, if you look at the trends on social media today related to this story, most of the conversation is being driven out of the United States, Mexico, and Spain. And you would think, okay, why is Cuba not on the list? Remember that only about 5% of the Cuban public has access to any sort of Wi-Fi, so it's very difficult and often very expensive to share these kind of views on social media. However, there is one trend that I was watching earlier, which is hashtag Hasta Siempre Comandante. Now, this is a reference to a Che Guevara letter after he left the island back in the 60s, I believe. And it's a beautiful letter and song, and people are bringing that up and saying goodbye, farewell to the Comandante. And one other post here, which is one of the most widely shared today, which says, "Castro left Cuba with free healthcare, free schools, and not a single street in his name or a single statue in his honor." Now, we spoke to our community as well, asking this question, basically, is he a hero or a villain? Let me just skip to the results here, and look at that. 50% of you said that he was a hero, 34% a villain, and 16% other. Lots of good comments there. Go ahead and continue sending your thoughts to us using the hashtag AJNewsGrid.
Thank you, Andrew. And as you can imagine, plenty of Cuba-related material at aljazeera.com. But if I could point you just to this one little thing, it's My Cuba. 6-part series. Each of those follows a different person and how they're adjusted to Cuba's re-emergence from the Castro years. They are personal, they're beautifully filmed. There's a quiz there as well. You can find out how much you know about the country. Maps, so much there for you. Search for My Cuba at aljazeera.com. It is well worth your time. All right, we're back at the live wall having a look at what's coming in. The live pictures, of course, coming in from Little Havana in Miami, where Andy Gallagher was before. Right now, though, over to Mariam Namazi with a look at some of the other day's news.
Thanks very much, Kamal. We begin in Iraq, where the parliament has passed a bill to recognize Shia fighters, the Popular Mobilization Forces, as an official part of the government fighting force. The PMF are currently playing a vital role in the battle for the city of Mosul, fighting ISIL to the west of the city at the town of Talafa. The Shia fighters are pushing to retake the key strategic town, which lies on a supply line from Mosul to ISIL-held territory in Syria. The bill will see the establishment of the Popular Mobilization Forces Commission, which would operate alongside the Iraqi military establishment, but will remain financially and managerially independent. Charles Stratford has more from Mahmour, 70 kilometers south of Mosul.
Just to give you some indication of the seriousness of this, the passing of this bill, it was only yesterday that Vice President Osama al-Nujafi said that if it was indeed passed, it would weaken the military and create more sectarian, potentially more sectarian tension. Just to give you some background of these groups, these are Iranian-backed Shia militias. They're called in Arabic Hashd al-Shabi, and they are currently pivotal in an operation around the town of Tel Afar. So we understand that they've taken control of around 7 villages in that area. They've already cut off the main road from Tel Afar to Raqqa, which is the escape route or presumed escape route for ISIL fighters trying to get into Syria. We believe that they are trying also to cut off the main road from Mosul to Tel Afar. They don't basically garner much trust among many Iraqis, many Sunnis, many Kurdish Iraqis in this country. The Iraqi leader has ordered them not to go into Tel Afar, and that's on the back of a statement made by the Turkish leader, Mr. Erdogan, who said that if indeed atrocities were committed against the predominantly Turkmen population of Tel Afar, then there was a threat there of Turkish intervention. We know that the Turkish military have had a presence here in Iraq of around about 1,000 troops since 2015. But this passing of the bill, which effectively makes this group almost a part of the military, has, yes, serious ramifications. Will indeed they be given the go-ahead to go into Tel Afar? And if they do, then obviously it's going to cause seemingly a lot more sectarian tension, both in this country and with regional neighbours.
Well, in other developments, the Iraqi Prime Minister says a European Union representative has told them they are satisfied with the human rights situation in the battle for Mosul. Haider al-Abadi is disputing claims from Amnesty International that the Iraqi military is behind unlawful killings.
Everyone is committed to the plan. I haven't heard any complaints, particularly from the areas of the popular resistance. We've met with the representative of the European Union who expressed his satisfaction with human rights matters during the military operations, and who also said that we shouldn't pay too much attention to reports by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International because they have their own agendas.
Syrian government forces have captured large parts of Hanano neighborhood in besieged eastern Aleppo. 60% of the northern district is reported to have fallen to troops loyal to President Bashar al-Assad, backed by Iranian, Iraqi and Afghan fighters. If the government gains complete control of Hanano, it's believed other neighborhoods would soon follow, allowing the Syrian army to attack the rebels from several directions. At least 11 people have been killed in fresh airstrikes over other rebel-held neighborhoods in eastern Aleppo on Saturday. White Helmet volunteers have already been rescuing civilians, including a young child trapped under the rubble on Friday. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says 53 people, including 5 children, were killed in Friday's airstrikes in eastern Aleppo and the surrounding areas. Moving to Kuwait now, where people are heading to the polls to vote for a new parliament in the 7th general election in a decade. Almost 500,000 Kuwaitis are eligible to vote for 293 candidates, 15 of whom are women. 50 seats are up for grabs. The election is taking place amid disputes over the country's austerity measures. Parliament was dissolved last month by the Emir, setting the stage for a snap election. And at least 10 people have been killed near a busy market in the Somali capital, Mogadishu. Authorities say a suspected car bomb exploded at a police checkpoint next to the market. Dozens more were injured in the attack. Police say the death toll is likely to rise. That's it from me for now. Back to Kamal.
Lovely. Thank you for that, Mariam. You're with the NewsGrid on air, online. The hashtag is AJ NewsGrid. In fact, contact details coming up there in a moment. If you have got any, actually, if you're in Little Havana in Miami, or if you are even in Havana itself in Cuba, I know internet connections are not great there. We would love to get any pictures, video or audio you can send us. Easiest way to do that is with the WhatsApp number +974 501 11149. We'd love to get some of your content, get it on air. Ahead on the grid, we're going to look at Fidel Castro's lasting legacy in Africa and why some of the continent's leaders saw him as a hero. That and more news in a moment. The headlines at AlJazeera.com and what's trending as well. It is Castro all the time there at the top there. And some of the varying connections that he's had as well. Plenty of online coverage at AlJazeera.com. The making of a legend. Cuban Americans celebrating the passing of Castro. That is what you are looking at this Saturday at AlJazeera.com. So we brought you some Twitter reaction from world leaders earlier regarding the death of Fidel Castro, but you know, world leaders have had plenty to say about him for many, many decades now. In 2007, for example, the late Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez described Castro as a grand master, adding, "A man like Fidel will never die because he will always be part of the people." In 2001, Nelson Mandela praised the Cuban Revolution and its leader, exclaiming, "Long live the Cuban Revolution, long live Comrade Fidel Castro." Not everyone was a fan, though, of course. Unsurprisingly, it is the US presidents who lead that pack. Back in 1962, the year before he was assassinated, John F. Kennedy said, "Castro isn't just another Latin American dictator, he's a petty tyrant, bent on personal power and gain." And another US president, Ronald Reagan, quipped in 1986 that people were calling him the George Washington of Cuba, and George rolled over in his grave. So there's no doubt Castro was a thorn in the side of the United States. He survived many assassination plots, including one extraordinary plan to poison his cigar. Rob Reynolds reflects on the rockiest of international relations.
Hasta la victoria siempre.
He was the bane of 11 American presidents and outlived 5 of them. His actions drew the U.S. into a disastrous failed invasion and brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. For 5 decades, Fidel Castro had an indelible effect on U.S. foreign policy and domestic politics.
The United States was accustomed to dominating Cuba and most of the other Latin American countries, certainly those in the Caribbean. The rulers were supposed to do what we wanted them to. Castro did not.
Before Castro led his guerrilla fighters down from the hills to depose the decadent and brutal dictator Fulgencio Batista, Havana was a playground for the American jet set, a libertine haven of gambling, gangsters, iced rum, and tropical sex. Castro's communist rule put a stop to that party, expropriated U.S. businesses, and seized private property. The U.S. slapped a trade embargo on Cuba and welcomed a rapid exodus of the island's wealthy and middle classes, who set up a politically powerful exile community in Florida. In the context of the Cold War, Castro's increasingly close ties with the Soviet Union were intolerable to U.S. leaders.
The United States was not going to sit still for that. We were accustomed to having Cuban leaders do what we wanted. Castro obviously was not going to do what we wanted, and so the United States began mounting an effort against him. In other words, the Bay of Pigs.
The invasion took place in April 1961 while John F. Kennedy was president. The CIA, with poor intelligence on the ground in Cuba, assumed the invasion would spark a popular uprising to topple Castro. In fact, Cuban armed forces using Soviet-supplied heavy weapons decimated the invading force. The next phase in the U.S.-Cuban conflict brought the world as close as it has ever been to all-out nuclear war. On October 16, 1962, reconnaissance photos showing Soviet nuclear missile installations in Cuba were shown to President Kennedy. As Kennedy and his advisors held frantic meetings and initiated secret diplomacy, the U.S. military prepared responses, including an invasion force and plans for aerial attacks. On October 22nd, Kennedy gave a somber speech to the American people, announcing a naval blockade of Cuba and warning Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Soviet ships carrying weapons headed for Cuba turned back. Castro was cut out of the diplomacy that ended the crisis, but later revealed he urged Khrushchev to attack the U.S., knowing that Cuba and its people would be annihilated. Decades later, as the Soviet Empire crumbled to dust, Castro stubbornly stood by his communist dogma. Illness forced Castro to turn over the reins of power to his brother Raul. And in the end, even so dynamic and enduring a figure as Fidel Castro grew old and feeble. In his final years, he appeared a pale shadow of his former self. But he lived to see President Barack Obama reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba, symbolically bringing the era of Fidel to an end. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Washington.
You know, Fidel Castro, just to widen this out a bit, he was convinced Africa would play a big part in his plans for a world revolution. Now, I saw a tweet from our reporter Barnaby Phillips this morning, who's written extensively about this, and we've asked him to explain a little bit more about Castro's Africa interventions. Have a look.
When I heard that Fidel Castro had died, I thought straight away of Angola and its bushland in the south, what the Portuguese colonialists used to call as terras no fim do mundo, the land at the end of the earth, where Fidel Castro sent tens of thousands of Cuban soldiers to fight on behalf of a fellow Marxist government against rebels who were backed by apartheid South Africa. They won a great battle there, Quito Carnival, and if you're trying to understand how apartheid ended in southern Africa, you have to look at the Battle of Quito Carnival. I lived in Angola in the 90s, and I met many young people who'd been sent to Fidel Castro's Cuba in a spirit of revolutionary solidarity to study at universities. I also met many old Cuban soldiers who lived in Angola, who'd married local women, and who were very well integrated. Well, is this all ancient history today? In some ways it is, because of course Ronald Reagan, Jonas Savimbi, and now Fidel Castro himself are all dead. But his legacy lives on, because the Marxist MPLA government, which he supported in Angola so crucially, is still there, perhaps now thoroughly corrupted by oil wealth. Fidel Castro enabled revolutionary left-wing governments to stay in power in Africa, and long after their idealism has faded, the idealism of the 70s and 80s, many of them are still there today.
Barnaby Phillips there. All right, we'll move on to some other news on the grid today. It is between 0 and 3 degrees Celsius right now in Seoul, South Korea's capital, but it hasn't stopped another huge wave of protests there and in many other towns and cities. Organisers said 1.5 million people turned up. Police, they're saying about 260,000. Whatever the number, it shows just how angry people remain about their scandal-plagued president, Park Geun-hye. From Seoul, Harry Fawcett with more.
It's getting colder, this bizarre scandal is getting older, but still South Koreans flood the streets to demand the resignation of their president. This fifth successive Saturday demonstration was claimed to be the biggest, not just in 5 weeks, in South Korean history. At exactly 8 o'clock, they doused their candles, put out the lights, and chanted for Park Geun-hye to step down.
This is actually my first time. I feel very proud now, and I will continue to join more rallies whenever possible.
We will continue to participate because we know that the president is hoping that we will eventually give up.
Every week, it seems, the protesters find ways to break new ground. A court ruling allowed them within an unprecedented 200 meters of the presidential compound, the Blue House. Her staff told local media the president was watching on TV, but she could surely have heard them, even with the sound down. Park has presidential immunity from prosecution in the case involving her longtime friend, Choi Soon-sil, accused of intervening in state affairs and using her connections to enrich herself. So far, Park's refusing to leave office. The opposition says it has the support to impeach her as early as next Friday. The eventual verdict from the Constitutional Court could take months. The people on the streets don't want to wait.
So this is the 5th straight weekend that people have given up their Saturday night to come down here in their tens of thousands, despite the bitter weather, despite the fact that this story has just gone on and on. The desire among these people, at least, for the end of the Park Geun-hye presidency is as strong as ever.
It's a logistical feat as much as anything. Stages and sound systems all costing up to $200,000 a time. Organisers say they'll keep going until they succeed.
For now, Park is not accepting the demand to step down immediately. Although the weather could have a partial impact, the size of the participation overall will stay the same, and we are making preparations accordingly.
What's striking is how good-natured this is. Police buses attacked with nothing more than stickers, protesters themselves helping clear the windscreen. Their determination to oust their president, so far at least, only matched by hers to stay in office. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, Seoul.
And it's been interesting to watch these protests through an online filter. This is Oh My News, a South Korean news website with the motto, "Every citizen's a reporter." It's driven by freelancers and everyday people. It live streams these protests without fail. It has people in the crowd talking to protesters past midnight, still going there on Oh My News. Interesting to look at through a different filter there. Now, to what many regard as a losing battle, the war on drugs. Thailand's military government, for example, is one that has seen the writing on the wall. They're looking at decriminalising methamphetamines. Scott Heidler has that story now from Bangkok.
Yaba pills like these have ruined the lives of tens of thousands of Thais. The cheap methamphetamine pills are potent, prevalent, and used by people across the economic spectrum. To fight this, the government declared a war on drugs 20 years ago, but it has failed.
When I took this job 2 years ago, I questioned Thailand's laws and approach to combat drugs. If we are doing this correctly, then why are drugs still widespread? And why are the prisons overcrowded?
The minister says it's time for a change and is pushing to decriminalize methamphetamine. The head of the country's prisons sees the new drug policy as a way to help those who are addicts, not hardened criminals, and alleviate overcrowding.
The new approach is to treat drug abuse as a health issue rather than criminal, and to provide addicts with rehabilitation.
The UN agrees with this approach.
The Ministry of Justice have clearly stated that they don't want to legalize methamphetamine. What they want to do is to reduce the criminal charges associated with possession.
So the traffickers and manufacturers of yaba and other drugs will still go to jail.
There are 300,000 inmates in Thailand's prisons. That's double the amount that they're supposed to hold. 70% of them are inside on drug-related charges. 9 out of 10 of them because of methamphetamines. That's 190,000 prisoners.
The idea is that fewer people like this 34-year-old from Bangkok will be jailed. He took yaba pills to work longer hours as a motorbike taxi driver. He was sentenced to life as a dealer. Current laws state that if someone has 5 or more pills, they are charged for dealing. But it will be challenging to change the minds of Thais who have been told for years that drugs are the enemy.
Now yaba is everywhere. And how do we live in peace if new laws take place?
If the government doesn't suppress yaba, more people will become addicts. The whole country will become addicted.
The administration has likened changing people's minds about decriminalizing meth will be like shifting their DNA. And that will surely take some time to do, but if they don't, yaba will continue to be trafficked and Thailand's prisons will become even more crowded. Scott Heidler, Al Jazeera, Bangkok.
So let's expand on this more. It was only late last year the Global Commission on Drugs Policy, a research organisation, described the global war on drugs as a catastrophic failure. They said the only way forward was decriminalisation. So here is their argument. At the moment, you've got a war on drugs being fought on 2 main platforms, crime and punishment. That is, making drugs illegal and then punishing those who make, traffic, sell or use them. To that end, more than 500,000 people in the United States alone are behind bars for anything from dealing, producing, or being caught with dope in their pocket. This is supposed to be a deterrent, but it's not really working that way, because if you look at these numbers, and we're looking at 2003 to 2014 worldwide, the number of people aged 15 to 64 who reported consuming an illicit drug was up 33% to 247 million. So what to do? Well, the Commission said more countries should follow, for example, Portugal. There, since 2001, drug possession for personal use is punished by fines and community service rather than jail time. There have been fewer fatal overdoses, fewer HIV infections, more addicts have sought treatment, and there's been no overall rise in drugs use. So let's talk about this with Ruth Dreyfus, who's the chair of the Global Commission on Drugs Policy, former President of Switzerland, joining us via Skype from Geneva. We thank you so much for your time today. Just tell me basically your view, first of all, what I've just outlined. Do you think it makes sense, the decriminalisation? Can it work?
Decriminalisation works, but it's also just a principle. Why should the state punish people who are not harming other people? Why should they have harsh punishment for little petty crimes? So, I mean, there is a whole system that should be changed with the decriminalisation of consumption and the preparation of the own consumption, which means possession, and on the other side, proportionality for the punishment of those who, pushed by misery, by the lack of perspective, economic perspective, enter into the small business of drugs. I mean, often they are also under threat from gangs. So let us concentrate on the real criminal organization and let us find solution for the consumer on one side, but also the petty criminals on the other.
Okay, what about, and this is some questions I've got from our viewers sending in questions on Twitter and WhatsApp. One is saying, how will this help or affect the millions of people who've been affected by the illegal drugs trade? Will it help actually prevent drug addiction of individuals? We're talking about the crime here. What about the people physically affected by it?
I can speak about my experience. For 10 years, I was responsible for health policy, but also for drug policy in my country. And I can tell you, as long as the people were consuming in underground, in unsafe environment, chased by the police, chased by the dealers, we had a large epidemic of AIDS, and now we know also that we have a large epidemic of hepatitis C, that the people were dying by overdoses, and they are now in the United States of America. But going to these people, giving the people the possibility to reduce the harm of their consumption, giving them the information they need, giving them places where they can consume safely, this was the solution. And really, I mean, we reduced the contamination, we reduced the petty criminality, and we reduced the death toll of this without augmenting the consumption. You spoke about the experience in Portugal. In Portugal, there was not an increase of consumption. In the Czech Republic, which decriminalized totally the consumption, there is no increase of consumption.
Right.
So, I mean, yes, it...
Oh, dear. Ruth, I'll leave you there. Go grab yourself a glass of water. Thank you so much for your time, though. Ruth Dreyfus joining us from Geneva. And, well, Andrew Chappell, let's go over to you and see what you've got on this one.
That's right, Kamal. So, we've asked our community today in terms of issues of drug policy in their countries, if this affects them, and especially with issues of decriminalization, how they would warm to certain proposals from UN officials or former government officials to decriminalize drugs. And it's helpful to look at the use of drugs across the world in certain countries. And now this is a map that was posted by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, I believe, and it will take you through the substance abuse issues across the world, just to give you a sense of what the problem is in certain countries. So you can see that there are certain parts of the world that have a bigger problem with amphetamines as compared to cannabis, if we switch over to that, or any other type of drug. So this is something we've been asking our community today. We've heard from several people on WhatsApp who've said that they have certain concerns, especially one viewer in Uganda said that there are a number of concerns in his country and he doesn't know what it would mean to other African states. Now, we are curious to hear what you think, so feel free to send us a tweet using the hashtag AJNewsGrid, and we will continue to explore this topic. And I've gone ahead and shared this map on my personal Twitter account. You can find me at Andrew Chappell if you want this resource or others. Kamal?
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Andrew. And if you dive into the archives of Upfront with Mehdi Hassan at aljazeera.com, you'll find this discussion panel on potentially ending the war on drugs, the argument being it hasn't worked, certainly in the United States. So why not try something else? You'll find that up front in the discussions section at the top at aljazeera.com. All right, coming to the end of the grid, still more for you though. We've managed to fit in an important story for you from India. It's really pulled at our heartstrings. You can see why. That for you in a moment. Right after we show you what happens when a desert capital suddenly gets a downpour.
Of your book.
You're with the NewsGrid here on Al Jazeera. Remember I said Donald Trump tweeted a little bit earlier saying Fidel Castro is dead? Well, he's expanded a bit more. Just got this off the news wires. Trump hopes Castro's death marks a move away from the horrors endured for too long and towards a future in which the wonderful Cuban people finally live in the freedom they so richly deserve. He says our administration, the incoming one, will do all it can to ensure the Cuban people can finally begin their journey towards prosperity and liberty. So a very forward-thinking message there from Donald Trump, the US president-elect, matching in some ways what the current President Barack Obama has said already. Okay, we've got a bit of a heartbreaking tale for you now when animals and humans collide with often tragic results. I'll catch up with my script here. Where's it gone? Here we go. It reminds us that if these great animals are to survive, we humans need to be a bit more aware of the consequences of our actions. Our team at AJ Plus took a look at one such collision of humanity and nature in India. Tough to watch, isn't it? My goodness me, that even hurt some of the hardened producers of us here at Al Jazeera. Looking at the live shot of Havana, I believe, right now, the flag at half-mast, or heading to half-mast, to mark the passing of Fidel Castro at the age of 90. contrasted, of course, with the pictures we saw earlier from Little Havana in Miami, where they're celebrating, all those Cubans in exile in Miami, celebrating the absolute end of an era there. It's been an interesting day, hasn't it? Quite fascinating. The end of a revolution in some ways. The end of the revolution, the end of Fidel Castro. So many ways for you to get in touch with us if you want to. Thoughts on any of our stories, always use the hashtag AJNewsGrid. You can tweet at AJ English. That's where the polls go up that Andrew was telling you about before. Facebook.com/AJNewsGrid is where you can watch the live stream and also comment while you're watching. Great way to keep in touch with the show. And if you've got any content to send us, +974 501 11149 on WhatsApp. I'm Kamal Santamaria. We'll see you back here, Studio 14, 1500 GMT, Sunday.